And I want to ask a question. What role does faith play in the miracles that Jesus is performing? What role does it actually play? We're called to have faith. But in the example that we just read, the question that the open loop that comes into my mind is, well, does the lack of faith, does it limit God's power in terms of doing his work? Or does it limit just the participation in his work? Right? Does it limit, because again, when we see some Christian circles, they kind of talk about faith with this idea of like, well, you just didn't have enough faith to accomplish it. You didn't have enough faith for God to heal that. You didn't have enough faith. And they kind of talk about it in such a way that it's like, so you're saying that my lack of faith or something like that would limit his power? Or is it that it just limits what we get to engage with? It limits the participation of us seeing and being a part of what God wants to do. It's an interesting question. I'll be honest with you. More Christians than you know get stuck here. They get stuck here. They may be trucking along, going to church and doing what they do, but they struggle because they don't know that they can answer this question truly. And the other reason I think this matters is, again, going back to this whole picture of what faith sort of gets us and doesn't get us and what it is and how it's measured. Faith is not a currency by which we buy protection. Okay, I want you to hear that. And I know it's a little bit, I'm still kind of following this movie theme, but I literally heard this week. There was a very famous comedian talking about his life and his life of faith at one point. And he talked about, he's like, it's kind of like the mafia. He's like, and in movies and things, he's just like the mafia, this historical idea that, well, you buy protection, from them, and then they protect your shop. It's not going to be messed with the other gangs and the other people because they're going to protect you. And he said that his life of faith was very similar. He's like, I bought into all of it. I bought into Jesus and God and the church and the beliefs. And he says, and then my shop still burned down. He's like, I bought into the protection, but my life still fell apart. Stuff still happened to me. That, of course, in his perspective, wasn't his fault. So it's like, stuff still happened, so I just gave it all up. Because that's how he saw his faith. As some sort of currency that sort of says, well, I don't have to experience what everybody else has to experience in this world. And this is what we see in Luke 7. Luke 7 actually gives us a little bit of a picture. I'll briefly give you the glimpse of it. In Luke 7, again, Luke was taking the eyewitnesses' accounts for the record of his record and account of Jesus' life. And he talks a little bit about John the Baptist's disciples. That when John was in prison, he actually sent the disciples to Jesus. And all we know from the account is that they went to Jesus to say, hey, by John's words, are you the actual Messiah? Are you the chosen one? Or should we be looking for someone else? Right? And Jesus goes on to tell the disciples, well, go back and tell John. And he gives off some beautiful verses that kind of tie back to prophecy about the lame are healed and the dead, the people are risen from the dead, and there's all these miracles and all these things happening to sort of say, yes, the Messiah is here, and yes, I am the Messiah, and it's at work, and all these things are happening. But then he slips in a phrase that most people who read it on the surface believe it's kind of telling. He slips in a phrase and says, blessed are those who don't fall away because of me. He says that as a response to John. Blessed are those who don't fall away from their faith because of me. And he goes on to tell everybody in the moment, like, there's going to be no one that's greater than John the Baptist. But in the same words, he says, but even the one who's the least in the kingdom of God will still be greater than John the Baptist. And at that point, you just go, I have no idea what he said, right? Well, here's, again, there are lots of good commentaries. You can get really deep into this. You can dive deep, okay? You can get into, like, was it about the disciples? Was it about John's disciples? Was it because there was no TV or TikTok or whatever? They didn't know. There were a lot of people, impersonating the Messiah, claiming to be the Messiah. So, as they're hearing about all these things, John the Baptist wants his disciples, hey, is this the guy that I baptized? Is this the same guy? Like, make sure he's the right one. There's lots of theories along those, but the surface one that most people get to and most people tend to land on is the fact that Jesus is telling John, yes, I am the Messiah, and yes, all of these incredible things are happening, and yes, you're probably going to die by the evil of Herodias. Like there's no get out of jail free card that's happening. Blessed are those who don't fall away because of me. Basically saying, blessed are those whose faith remain even when I don't do what they think I should be doing. That tends to be the most common surface level, that people just don't get past that. And again, before you think about, well, poor John, he didn't deserve to die like that. Well, that's very true. But you know, Jesus was also crucified and betrayed and falsely accused. Like, it's not that he set John up to, like, John's experiencing the same evil that Jesus is going to be at the hand of. It's not any different. That's why he said, look, nobody's going to be greater than John when it comes to the prophets of this world, but even the least of these in the kingdom is going to be just as great as John. Your faith doesn't set you up for, again, some sort of get out of jail free card. Like, that's not how this works. So we have to be very, very careful that we don't see our faith as some sort of like, well, I need to have as much as possible so that it benefits me when the time comes. So that life can kind of work out the way I need it to work out. I believe this is the primary reason that Mark decides to say, by the way, this is what happened to John the Baptist, right in the middle of his account. Like, Herod was already wondering who he was, and he was fearful because he assumed it was John the Baptist come back from the dead. Because this is what happened to him. And then it goes on with the story. It goes on, we're back into the part of the story in the movie. The flashback is done, and it says this in verse 30. When the apostles returned to Jesus from their ministry tour and told him all they had done and taught. Could you just imagine the high those guys were on? Can you really? Like, can you imagine them coming back and being like, oh man, you wouldn't believe, Jesus, you wouldn't believe we saw this guy, and we were in the hood of this group, and we were in the suburbs of this place, and we did this, and this woman was crazy, and we did this, and the two other guys was like, man, you wouldn't even believe what we did. And, you know, they're telling stories. And just coming back from the experiencing and participating in the power of God to set free people who were victims and heal people and set them free from demons. Like, it was, I can't imagine. Matter of fact, Mark says that Jesus said, hey, let's go off by ourselves to a quiet place and rest a while, right? Because, I mean, they've been working hard, they've been experiencing, and we already know Jesus enjoys a good nap, right? Jesus is for it. So he said, let's get away, let's pull back just a little bit. His guys had experienced some incredible stuff. He said that this because there were so many people still coming and going that Jesus and his apostles didn't even have time to eat. So they left by a boat for a quiet place where they could be alone. It says, but many people recognized them, and they saw them leaving, and people from many towns ran ahead along the shore, and they got there ahead of them. And Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped out of the boat, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. Just went right back in to ministry mode. Now, late in the afternoon, his disciples come to him, and they say, this is a remote place, and it's already getting late, Jesus. I mean, we were coming away to pull away from this stuff. We're so far out of the thing. Let's go. Late in the afternoon, he says, send the crowds away so they can go nearby farms and villages and buy something to eat. This is a huge crowd. It tells us later it's 5,000 plus men, women, and children, so it's 10,000 plus. He says, but Jesus says, you feed them. That's Jesus' response. You feed them. With what? Right? They asked. We'd have to work for months in order to earn enough money to buy food for all these people. Catering wasn't in the job description, Jesus. And Jesus says, well, how much bread do you have? Go and find out, because they don't know. Go and find out. So they came back and reported. We have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. You see from another account that they stole a kid's lunch. This is all we have. So Jesus told the disciples to have the people sit down in groups and on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of 50 or 100. Jesus took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looked up to heaven, blessed them, breaking the loaves into pieces. He kept giving the bread to disciples so they could distribute it to the people. And he also divided the fish, right, for everyone to share. They all ate as much as they wanted, okay? Old New Testament buffet right here. That's what it is. It's like, imagine, oh, I sure would like to have more of that, right? So they had their fill, is what it says. They ate as much as they wanted to eat. But then afterwards, the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftover bread and fish. 12 baskets of leftovers. And the total was about 5,000 men and their families were fed that day. Now, again, this is one of those encounters and stories that people just could preach a whole message just on this story. Why? Because it's beautiful. It's amazing. It's so cool. And again, part of the multiplication of what I'm seeing, especially when the context of Mark giving us his gospel, is again helping them see, hey, when it comes to multiplication, it's not just about, expanding what God was doing, sending you out 2 by 2 to do the same thing. He wanted them to continue to learn the lesson, right? Our earthly limits can't stop a limitless God. It can't. Like, that was the lesson he wanted them to see. You're going to see it a little bit later on. You'll see those words come up again and again. What is impossible with man is possible with God, right? You're going to see that in a couple weeks. Like, these are words he will repeat because he's trying to get the lesson across. That it does not limit God's power in any way, shape, and form. That it might limit participation, but it does not limit God. He can send you out in power to go do what he himself is doing in terms of multiplication. When he looks at them and says, you feed them, sometimes people wonder, like, well, who is this miracle for? Do you honestly think the miracle was for the 10,000 plus people in the crowd? Because Jesus just didn't want them to feel a little tiny bit of hungry? Do you think that's who the miracle was for? They could have just left and went and bought every other day. That's what they do. They could have left and went to a village and a farm and bought stuff and done. You really think the miracle was for them? No, the miracle was for the disciples. He said, you feed them. He wanted them to just wrestle with, oh yeah, we can't do that. And Jesus is like, you sure can. If you really understood this lesson, you sure can. You think only having 7 loaves and 5 loaves and 2 fish, you think that's a problem for God? It's not a problem. Why would he have the disciples go pick up all the food? Right? There's no Tupperware. There's no fridge to put it in. Like, this food's going bad in a day. It wasn't just Jesus being a good steward. This isn't a stewardship thing. This is I want the disciples to make their way through 10,000 people who are stuffed to the gills, and I want them to collect the provision, the over and above and beyond overflow of the provision of God. It was for the disciples. And as a matter of fact, Mark tells us specifically that towards the end of the chapter. It was for them. Nothing's going to stop a limit. Our limits don't stop him. Okay, continues on. Here's, again, Jesus is like, let's go, okay? Immediately after this, Jesus insisted the disciples get into the boat, head across the lake to Bethsaida, where he sent the people home. And after telling them to go goodbye, he went up to the hills to pray by himself. So we see this again often. Jesus is going to pull away to recharge, talk to his heavenly Father. That's his discipline. Late that night, though, the disciples are out in their boat, and they're in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on the land. He saw that they were in serious trouble, rowing and struggling, right? Rowing hard, struggling against the wind and waves. So about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came walking out towards them, walking on the water. He intended to go past them. I think that's just Mark's way of saying it. He was intending to kind of go to flank them, right? To come up on their side, not directly at them. But when they saw him walking on the water, they cried out in terror, as if he was a ghost. And Mark tells us, hey, they were all terrified when they saw him. But Jesus spoke to them at once. Hey, don't be afraid, guys. Don't be afraid. Take courage, I'm here. Don't be afraid. Take courage, I'm here. Now again, Mark in his account is going to take us right to the point of what Mark is trying to make. Okay? He's going to take us right there in verse 51 and 52. But I don't want to get there yet, and here's the reason why. Because I just want to help us see and understand one of the reasons we love the multiple accounts of the gospel is because there are always different angles of what people are trying to learn from what happened with these disciples in Jesus' life. And so Matthew actually tells us that this is the exact same moment where not only did Jesus walk on the water, but Peter walks on the water. Right? So I don't know what it was. I don't know if Peter and Mark, as Peter's telling Mark and Mark's writing the gospel, I don't know if it was just one of those things where Peter didn't want to make it about him in the moment. That doesn't seem to be Peter's personality, but maybe he was growing. But he maybe didn't want to make it about him. He wanted to keep it about Jesus and kind of, again, get to the point they were trying to make. But Matthew wants us to see what happened specifically with Peter. Not just what happened to all the disciples, but specifically with Peter. And so again, we get to this point where Jesus says, don't worry guys, don't be afraid, I'm here. And Matthew tells us that Peter called out to him and said, Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come out to you and walking on the water. So Jesus said, yeah, come on out. Peter went out to the side of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. Just one more thing for the day, right? Think about all the experiences they just had. And now Peter is out walking on water. I mean, again, I just, sometimes I put myself in the shoes I can't even fathom. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, which were still there, by the way, the whole time, but when he recognized them again, when he saw them again, he was terrified and then began to sink. Save me, Lord, he shouted. And Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. You have so little faith. Jesus said, why did you, what's the two words? Say it out loud. Doubt who? Yeah, doubt me. Okay? Again, Jesus, I say that to say Jesus is always kind of reminding us that even when he says words like that, again, I don't want to get caught up in this, but like, why do you have so little faith? It's not about the size or the amount. It's like, why would you doubt me? Why would you doubt me? You know, I've already calmed the winds and the waves. You've already done some incredible things in my name. You've cast out demons. You've healed people. You just saw me multiply nothing, barely anything, into more than enough. Why would you doubt me? Why would you doubt me?